I'm 82 now. At this age, most of the noise has gone quiet. The house is still more often than it isn't, and the things that used to feel urgent, deadlines, bills, meetings, have mostly disappeared. But something else takes their place: memories, and the slow, uncomfortable understanding of them. I used to say I had a happy marriage. 53 years. That's what I told people. They would smile when they heard that number, the way people do when they think they're looking at something sturdy and good. Sometimes younger couples would ask how we managed it. I always gave the same answer. Patience, I'd say. Compromise. Those words sounded respectable enough that no one asked further. But patience and compromise can hide many things. I didn't realize that until I was 80. That was the year my wife Margaret died. People assume that when someone passes after so many decades together, the surviving spouse mostly feels grief. And I did grieve, but grief wasn't the only thing that arrived. Something else came with it. A kind of clarity I had never allowed myself before. And once it arrived, it didn't leave. I met Margaret when I was 26. It was 1970. I was working at a small insurance office downtown. Nothing glamorous, gray desks, fluorescent lights that buzzed all afternoon. Margaret worked 2 floors above me as a receptionist for a law firm. We met in the elevator. That's the honest truth of it. No romance, no fireworks, just 2 people standing next to each other while the doors slid shut. She smiled first. Margaret had an easy smile, not the kind meant to impress anyone, just the kind that appears when someone is naturally comfortable in the world. We started riding the elevator together most mornings after that. Small talk at first, weather, work, the terrible coffee in the building lobby. After a few weeks, we had lunch together. A few months later, we were spending most evenings together. I remember thinking she made life steadier. That was the word I would have used back then. Steady. I had grown up in a house that wasn't steady. My father moved from job to job. My mother worried constantly about money. The air in our home always felt tense. Margaret wasn't like that. She paid her bills on time. She kept a tidy apartment. She remembered birthdays. Being around her made the future feel predictable in a way I liked. So when I asked her to marry me, it didn't feel like a leap. It felt like the sensible next step. We bought a small house 2 years later. Nothing fancy. A narrow brick place with a patchy lawn and a kitchen that always smelled faintly of onions because Margaret cooked most evenings. Our life followed a rhythm. I left for work before 8. She worked part-time after our daughter was born. Evenings were quiet. Dinner at the table. Television afterward. Weekends meant groceries, yard work, sometimes a movie. If someone had looked in from the outside, they would have said we were doing everything right. And for many years, I believed that myself. Margaret didn't complain. That was one of the things I admired about her. She rarely raised her voice, rarely argued. If something bothered her, she usually let it pass. At the time, I thought that meant we were well suited. Now I wonder if it meant something else. There were moments, though, small ones, moments that didn't seem important enough to examine. I remember one evening when our daughter was maybe 10. Margaret had made a roast chicken. I was reading the newspaper at the table. She said something about wanting to visit her sister the following weekend. Her sister lived 2 hours away. I remember barely looking up from the paper. I said something like, "Next weekend's busy." Maybe another time. Margaret nodded. That was it. The conversation ended there. At the time, that seemed normal to me. But years later, I realized something about that moment. Margaret never mentioned the trip again. Not that week, not the next month. She simply stopped bringing it up. There were many small moments like that. I missed her sister's birthday dinner because of work. I skipped a school play because a client meeting ran late. Margaret would say it was fine, and I believed her. Or maybe I preferred believing her. Looking back, I can't remember many arguments in our marriage. People used to admire that. 50 years and you two never fight, they'd say. But I've come to think that the absence of arguments doesn't always mean peace. Sometimes it means silence. Margaret filled our home with quiet competence. Laundry always folded. Meals always cooked. Christmas cards sent on time. She remembered everyone's anniversaries. I handled the practical things, mortgage payments, taxes, repairs. We functioned well together. That's the truth of it. But functioning well isn't the same as knowing someone. I didn't realize that then. When you're in the middle of a life, routine can feel like proof of happiness. You assume that if nothing is breaking, everything must be working. Years passed quickly. Our daughter grew up, moved away. Margaret and I remained in the same house. By our 60s, life had become even quieter. Retirement arrived for both of us within a year. Suddenly, we had long mornings with nowhere particular to go. Margaret started walking in the park most days. I stayed home reading or watching the news. Sometimes she asked if I wanted to come along. I usually said no. It didn't seem important. She never insisted. Looking back, I can see how often she invited me into her life in small ways. A walk, a drive to visit someone, a conversation that might have gone deeper if I had let it. But I had grown used to keeping things simple, comfortable, surface level. Then Margaret became sick. It started with fatigue, then hospital visits, doctor's appointments, tests that stretched across months. Eventually, there was a diagnosis, cancer. Even now, saying the word still feels strange. Those 2 years changed the pace of everything. Suddenly, time felt fragile. Margaret became thinner, quieter. Some nights she would sit at the kitchen table long after dinner, staring at nothing in particular. I would ask if she was all right. She would say yes, the same answer she had given for 50 years. Near the end, she spent more time in the hospital. One afternoon, I was sitting beside her bed, machines humming quietly. The window was open a few inches. I remember hearing traffic outside. Margaret was awake, but very tired. She looked at me for a long moment. Then she said something I still think about almost every day. She said, "We lived a very careful life, didn't we?" At the time, I didn't understand what she meant. I said something like, "Careful is good." She smiled faintly, but she didn't answer. Margaret died 3 weeks later. The house felt enormous after that. Not physically larger, just emptier in a way that was difficult to describe. For the first few months, I moved through the days almost automatically, making coffee, watching television, sleeping poorly. People visited at first, neighbors, family, but eventually everyone returned to their own routines. That's when the quiet began to deepen. When you live alone long enough, you start replaying things, conversations, moments, entire decades sometimes. And somewhere in those long afternoons, I began to see our marriage differently. Not suddenly, it arrived slowly. like noticing a crack in the wall that had probably been there for years. Margaret had been kind, reliable, patient, but when I looked back honestly, I realized something uncomfortable. I had spent most of our marriage assuming that contentment meant happiness, and I had assumed Margaret felt the same, but I never really asked, not in a serious way. I never asked if she felt fulfilled or lonely, or if there were things she wanted that never happened. I simply assumed that because she didn't complain, everything was fine. That realization is harder to live with than grief, because grief has a clear cause. Regret is more complicated. At 80, I found a box in the back of Margaret's closet. Inside were notebooks, just ordinary spiral notebooks. At first, I thought they were grocery lists or recipes, but when I opened one, I saw they were journals. Margaret had been writing in them for decades. Not every day, just occasionally. Short entries, thoughts about work, our daughter, the weather. But sometimes there were other things, lines that stayed with me. One entry from the late 1980s said, "I wonder what life would have been like if we had taken more chances." Another from the 1990s read, "He worked so hard, I wish we talked more." There was no anger in those pages, no bitterness, just quiet wondering. That's what made it difficult to read. Margaret had loved me. I believe that. But love doesn't always mean someone feels fully seen or fully known. And as I sat in that quiet house reading her handwriting, I realized something that felt almost unbearable. For most of our marriage, I had mistaken stability for connection. We had built a life that looked successful from the outside, but inside it, many things had gone unspoken. And now the one person who could have explained them was gone. That's the part people don't talk about when they celebrate long marriages. Time alone doesn't guarantee understanding. Sometimes it just guarantees familiarity. I still live in the same house. The lawn is smaller now, or maybe I just move slower. Some mornings I sit at the kitchen table where Margaret used to drink her tea. I try to remember the sound of her footsteps in the hallway. Memory does strange things at this age. Certain details fade, others stay sharp. What I remember most clearly now are the small invitations I declined, walks I didn't take, conversations I postponed. It never felt urgent at the time. That's the danger of ordinary days. They make you believe there will always be another one. If someone listening to this is younger than I am, I won't tell you what to do. Life is too complicated for that. But I will say something simple. If someone you love asks you to sit with them, or walk with them, or listen for a little while, it may matter more than you realize. Not because something dramatic will happen, but because those small moments are the ones that quietly shape a life. I learned that very late, much later than I would have liked. These days, I don't try to correct the past in my mind anymore. That doesn't work. The past stays where it is. All I can do now is remember Margaret honestly, not just as the patient woman who kept our home running, but as the person who wondered what life might have been like if we had been a little less careful. I think about that sentence often. We lived a very careful life. There's nothing wrong with careful, but sometimes careful leaves things untouched, unexplored, unsaid. I don't have many years left. At 82, the future is a much shorter road than the one behind me. Most evenings the house is quiet by 8. I turn off the lights, check the doors, and sit for a while before bed. Sometimes I imagine Margaret walking in from the park like she used to, her coat over one arm, that small, easy smile. It's strange what the mind does when the world becomes quiet enough. But eventually the room returns to what it is, just an old man sitting in a kitchen, thinking about the life he lived, and the one he didn't quite notice while it was happening.